welcome to Elements of Ayurveda, Empowering Wisdom of Life. I'm your host, Colette, and in this podcast, I hope to empower you to take charge of your own health by sharing the holistic teachings of Ayurveda, the ancient healing tradition from India. We will also discuss topics like health and wellness, nutrition, yoga, fitness, meditation, breath work, and much more, as well as interviewing lots of inspiring people along the way. My humble wish is to help you to connect to your true nature, to Mother Nature, and to each other. If you like the content, be sure to subscribe to the show, and the new episodes will automatically download for you to enjoy. If you're new to Ayurveda, I recommend you listen to the first couple of episodes where I do an introduction to Ayurveda and the mind-body types. I've also set up a Facebook group for us to connect and to support each other, and I'd love for you to join me over at Elements of Ayurveda podcast group. And now, here's the show. Hey, before we start the show, did you know that I'm hosting an Ayurveda and Yoga retreat right here on the French Riviera this October, the 11th to the 13th, a 3-day weekend of connection, education, and relaxation. We're going to enjoy lots of talks on Ayurveda, yoga classes, and Ayurvedic workshops, and we're going to hang out in this lovely medieval village which is just outside Nice, and Nice has the international airport, so it's really easy to access. If you're interested, please check out my website, elementshealingandwellbeing.com/retreat. So check it out. I would love to have you here and connect with you in person. It would be fantastic. So I hope you can join us. Okay, now let's get on with the show. Hello and welcome to Elements of Ayurveda. Today I want to introduce you to Victor Briere, who has an Ayurvedic practice based on the belief that a healthy body and mind are the pillars for a life full of spirit and joy. True health is the byproduct of a conscious life. As an Ayurvedic doctor, Victor's aim is to teach you the principles of health and guide you towards balance that can be self-sustained and generated from the inside out. Now, Victor was born and raised in Los Angeles, and his love of Kundalini Yoga led him to Ayurveda. He studied Ayurveda at Kerala Ayurveda Academy in both Los Angeles and in Kerala, India, where he spent time as a clinical intern at multiple Ayurvedic hospitals and wellness centers. He continued his education by learning the diagnostic art of Ayurvedic pulse reading with Dr. Vasant Lad and Dr. Suhas Kashirsagar. Victor, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Colette. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm very excited to have you here because I met you because we both studied at Kerala Ayurveda Academy, so I've met you in the past there, but also that you gave a panel presentation at the NAMA conference called Addiction, an Ayurvedic Perspective. And your focus there was on the vagus nerve, and I really enjoyed your presentation. And in fact, I scribbled loads of notes down. So that's why I'm really excited to talk to you today and to bring this information to the audience. Now, Victor, you started your presentation talking about Ayurveda's view on disease from the ancient texts. And you said that disease begins when we forget our true nature as spirit. So can we start off today by talking about that and explaining that to the listeners, please?
Definitely. It's one of my favorite things to talk about, because it's a distinguishing factor in Ayurveda and all forms of holistic medicine, which is we need to discover really deep down inside what the root cause of the disease or suffering is being generated from. Mm-hmm. And Ayurveda, in the traditional Ayurvedic scriptures, disease begins when we forget our true nature as spirit is one of the first things that you come across. Mm-hmm. And that's a huge statement. But if you follow the train all the way down to, you start out with pneumonia, and then you say, well, how did I get pneumonia? I was outside and it was cold and damp and wet, and my immune system was compromised, so I couldn't keep, my lungs balanced, so I developed pneumonia. Well, you go down the list, well, why were you outside and it was cold and wet and damp? And if you keep trailing it back, you get to some anxiety, or you get to some decision that you made that was not so beneficial for your health. Because probably because you wanted something else. You were going for something else. So, it's obvious to see in dietary cases, right? Mm-hmm. I'm gonna eat this thing that's not good for my health, but I'm not doing it just randomly. I'm doing it because I want to eat something that tastes good, that makes me feel happy for the moment.
Right.
So when you go all the way back and you're searching for the root cause of disease, you come to a place deep down where you forget that your true nature is a spirit. Mm. And that creates an anxiety, basically, a fundamental seed base level anxiety that's not always so obvious. We like to pin that anxiety on or blame that anxiety on things that are happening in our life that seem to be creating problems for us. Mm. But when we look at our foundation, when we forget our nature as true spirit, we get disturbed because then we become dependent on something outside of ourselves to be content or happy. And that makes us anxious because anything we depend on outside of ourselves to make ourselves content or happy is not under our control, right, basically. And so when that makes us feel insecure, mm-hmm. Unless everything's going right in our life, which, as we all know, is the unicorn of life, right? How often everyone say that, oh yes, everything in my life is going perfectly. And even if they can say that, for how long? Mm-hmm. And so that core insecurity about being dependent on something other than ourselves for our happiness and contentment creates an anxiety that creates a disturbance in our nervous system. And then that disturbance in our nervous system creates a behavior and a motivation to seek satisfaction or satiation of that disturbance. And typically, we will turn to a substance, food, or a relationship, or TV, or something, whatever the modern world provides. Mm. And then it's those behaviors and substances that imbalance our doshas, and then imbalanced doshas create the issues in our body. So that's what I believe it means when Ayurveda says disease begins when we forget our true nature, the spirit.
Absolutely. Well, that just makes so much sense because our true nature, we're going against that. And as Ayurveda says, this misuse of intellect or going against your true nature or what's good for you will always lead you down a path that's going to cause imbalances or aggravations and so on.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, so interesting. So do you then think, talking about addiction, which is what you were giving your panel presentation on, do you think that this obviously is one of the biggest factors in the cause of addiction?
Oh, absolutely. And that's why, all the mindfulness practices and meditation practices and yoga practices that are popping up around the modern viewpoints on how to deal with addiction are becoming more and more used and are seen as extremely effective because the core intention of those practices is to resolve that fundamental split between our psyche and its distance from its belief in our true nature as spirit.
Right.
And so, but in Ayurveda, or what happens is after that split occurs, we forget. That's what the line says. We forget. It's lost inside of us, or we can't see it, or we get so distracted with other things that it's inaccessible to us temporarily. And we use all these practices to bring us back to that place. So in Ayurveda, we have to a lot of times work backwards from the state of forgetfulness to the state of remembrance to resolve issues. But all throughout that process, the addiction is going to be in play. Mm-hmm. And so you can't really root out the cause of addiction until close to the end of the process.
Right.
You can put a Band-Aid on it. Mm-hmm. You can do things that temporarily distract people from their addiction. Mm-hmm. You can't ever really resolve the addiction until you get back to that place where the contentment's coming from within. Right.
To that belief system or that past trauma or whatever it was that segue the life and separated the spirit and the loss of that true self.
Yeah, exactly. And I tell, when I give talks or even in the clinic when I'm talking one-on-one to people, I frequently say, 99.999% of people are addicts. They're just, most of us do things that are completely socially acceptable, and it goes completely just under the radar.
Right.
And then, because what I consider an addiction can be anywhere from just feeling the need to be in a relationship or to have company to feel okay. That would count as an addiction. Now, that may not cause extreme diseases like alcoholism at a young age, but in the long run, that's going to create the same type or same quality of imbalance that the alcoholic faces.
Yeah. Yeah. So that same dependency on something exterior to yourself.
Right. And so as humans, we have to acknowledge that this is part of our dynamic and something that we need to balance within ourselves to live our fullest life. And that there shouldn't be this taboo around addiction as, this thing that is this terrible, awful, horrible, evil thing, which is commonly felt inside people because people acknowledge how dangerous it is. We need to acknowledge that, hey, all humans have this addictive tendency in them when things start to go wrong for them. And we need to be compassionate towards that.
Yeah, absolutely. And going on the fact that you said that most of us have addictive behavior, it's something that we all experience in one form or another.
Absolutely.
Right.
It's a matter of degrees, not whether it's there or not.
Yeah. So therefore we should all have compassion and understanding about this addictive behavior. So you mentioned some stats in your presentation. Could you share some of those with us today?
Yeah, I came across some statistics in when I was, embarking on this vagus nerve addiction thing to begin with that were really telling to me as to how far away from that fundamental state of existing as true spirit we've really gone. Because to me, there's a direct correlation between that and the amount or severity or intensity of addiction in the world.
Okay.
So some of those stats, just to name a few, and keep in mind, all these stats are increasing daily. Yeah. So they're not going the other direction. They're going up. So more than 30 million Americans are currently taking antidepressants. That's huge. That's a massive number of people. So that means that the likelihood walking down the street of people you interact with, you're going to, on a daily basis, you're going to be interacting with a good number of people who are actively taking antidepressants, which means that underneath that, they're depressed.
Right.
So most of your life, you're interacting with people on a daily basis that are fundamentally depressed, unhappy. And that's going to color your interaction with them.
Absolutely.
The rate of antidepressant use among middle-aged women, especially, far higher for the population as a whole. 1 out of every 4 women in their 40s and 50s is taking antidepressant medication. Wow. So the women in our society, this stat I think has an interesting twist to it because the women in our society are suffering, but a lot of men, I personally believe that just as many men are suffering because men have this terrible habit in our society of just not speaking up when they're suffering.
Right.
So the women are saying, hey, I need help, which is great. You need to do that, right? And then they're turning to antidepressants for that help. Just as many men are depressed, they're just not raising their hand.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Next stat is, and this was the one that got me in the heartstrings the most. 1/3 of all foster children in the United States are on at least one psychiatric drug.
Wow.
So what that tells me is that you get these kids who have already been abandoned in some way or another.
Yeah.
The way that we as a culture are managing the abandonment of these children is by drugging them.
Wow.
So I'm not saying that's not saying that I know a lot of these, kids, it's like at a certain extent, what do you do if they're exhibiting violent behavior or extreme behavior? We got to do something, and facilities can only handle so much.
Right.
But as a culture, we got to look at that and say there is a better way
Yeah.
to deal with this problem, and we have to start doing it. Otherwise, we're going to have a population of youth whose minds and brains are severely affected by the use of psychiatric drugs from practically out of the womb.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, that dependency on what's going to be their future.
For their whole life, they'll be dependent.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. And then that's going to perpetuate the cycle of depression. Mm-hmm. And it's those kinds of feelings that lead to really negative, destructive behaviors to both the self and others.
Yes. Yeah.
Another stat, should I keep going with the stats?
Yeah, because I think these are really interesting and tell us exactly what we're dealing with addiction.
Yeah. And so the next one is this one was just as bad, if not worse. Mm. This stat's from 2010, so keep in mind it's gotten worse since 2010. Right. The average teen in the United States is taking 1.2 central nervous system altering drugs.
Oh my goodness.
Such as, ADHD, all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So take this, for example. We'll go back to that first stat. 30 million Americans are currently taking antidepressants, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now zoom into your youth, your teens, who that was 2010. So now they're in their 20s. The average one, that means the majority of those people are on central nervous system altering drugs during the most developmental years of their life.
Right.
Right now, we are cultivating a population of almost 100% dependency on some kind of drug.
Wow. Not
a million Americans. That was from the previous generation.
Yes, exactly.
To me, that's a pretty massive alarm bell.
Yeah.
And then the last stat that I shared in that presentation was that Americans account for about 5% of the global population, and we consume more than 50% of the world's pharmaceutical drugs. So that if you look around, if you go outside and look around and you're in the United States, and I know this is very similar for other countries, first countries, you go around and look around at the population under these stats, I hope you see something different than you saw the other day, because you're basically looking at a population of addicts.
Right. Whoa, very sobering stats there. But
very sobering.
But I think, I remember when you read them out at the presentation, I was literally floored. But also, I think it's necessary to wake us up to what's going on and how can we deal with this differently.
We can't deal with it unless we acknowledge that it's going on.
Voila, exactly. Right? Yeah.
It mirrors the primary mode that addiction perpetuates itself, which is secrecy.
Yes.
So if we don't talk about it because of all the shame and guilt and negative emotion, all that taboo stuff I was saying earlier, then we can never resolve it.
Right, exactly. Okay, Victor, let's talk about this, and let's talk about how we can resolve it and Ayurveda's view on it. And I'd love to start focusing on the vagus nerve, which is something that you focused your presentation on. I think the research you've been doing is extremely interesting into the vagus nerve. So can you tell us about the important role that the vagus nerve serves in the body?
Absolutely. So just a little bit of context for our listeners.
Yes.
The vagus nerve vagus means wandering, and nerve is a nerve. So huge nerve that runs through your entire body, that it starts at your brainstem. It's the 10th cranial nerve, and it runs down your body, and it connects to every major organ in your body. So lungs, stomach, heart, spleen, you name it, liver, whatever you want. And it's a two-way street that communicates all sorts of information between all the vital organs and the brain, and vice versa. So it's completely hooked up. It's completely everyone's Facebook friends with each other. Everyone's talking constantly. so there's this this is like a holistic nerve.
Right.
It's the thing that weaves everything together. And it's got an intelligence of its own. It has its own functions, and it performs all the time, 24/7, without you having to think about it or do anything. So it has a lot of functions, but the main functions for the purpose of this talk is it governs whether you're going to live via your sympathetic nervous system, which is the nervous system that pretty much controls how you're going to act in the world, physically.
Yeah.
And your parasympathetic nervous system, which controls how you rest in the world. So just a little bit of context for that. When I say act and rest, I don't mean sitting around doing nothing versus moving around and doing a lot of things. It's nervous system activity. So you could be sitting in a chair doing nothing and you can be freaking out and in your sympathetic nervous system.
Right.
You could be playing basketball, running around a basketball court, and if you've trained or developed yourself right, you could still be subsiding in your parasympathetic nervous system to an extent. You can be balanced, meaning you switch from your sympathetic nervous system into your parasympathetic nervous system easily without trouble.
Right.
That's what the vagus nerve does.
Okay.
It switches back and forth. And if it gets damaged and you have trouble switching back and forth, you can get stuck. And if you get stuck, you got a problem. Because if you get stuck in your sympathetic nervous system, your body is not going to be able to heal and rejuvenate and digest properly. Is going to experience constant stress and anxiety.
Right.
And no matter what external stimulus you engage in, unless you can switch into your parasympathetic nervous system, it's not going to do you much good.
So you're always on. If you're stuck in the sympathetic nervous system, you're always essentially on.
You're always on, or you're on 95% of the day.
Right.
And one big thing with addiction in the vagus nerve, I may be jumping ahead a little bit, but it's important, is that addiction can be seen from this perspective as the body's attempt to get someone back in their parasympathetic nervous system.
Yes.
So, it's like pulling a ripcord on something that has, like on a chainsaw, right? And it won't catch. And so you pull harder and harder and harder, and you use oil and gasoline, and you pour substances into the system and do what you can to just get it to kick over.
Right.
Right. And so when something's wrong inside someone, when they have that imbalance in their vagus nerve and it won't switch over because of these deep-seated core fears and anxieties, they reach towards all sorts of wild stuff that typically are substitutes for love or affection or comfort or coziness.
Right.
That forces the body, at least temporarily, into the parasympathetic nervous system.
Right.
Alcohol is a great example.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Yes, absolutely. Very interesting. And, I think we often hear of where someone is, their body literally, aside from addiction as well, is like the body literally takes someone out. Like they go into a state of exhaustion or lethargy. That's almost could be the body trying to push this person into parasympathetic nervous system as well.
Definitely. The body has many systems that override other systems, and very intelligent creature.
Right.
I mean, it's really amazing.
Yeah.
So then that brings us to the next kind of major function of the vagus nerve, which is it's intimately connected to your sense organs, and it's constantly monitoring the world to determine how safe or threatening the world is at any given moment. So it governs your fight, flight, and freeze responses.
Right.
And this is huge because that is a massive dive into the ocean if you ever take that dive. Those three words are not just fight, flight, freeze when, someone's attacking you. It's on all the time in social relationships because we need more than just physical safety. everyone knows a child that doesn't receive love, affection, kindness, compassion, all those things starts to suffer. And in that suffering, it's not just an emotional thing. There's no such thing as just emotions. All that suffering is running through that child's nervous system.
Right.
And that starts to change the function of its body. And it turns that function of the body towards a sympathetic state, which is a grasp for survival. Because the child feels threatened, because it's not getting indications that the world's a safe, good, happy place,
right,
full of love. Right. So once that's happened, if the child gets stuck there and can't get back into its parasympathetic nervous system, that's going to severely alter that child's health profile. And it's going to start developing problems. And then that child might develop addictions. As soon as certain substances become available, the child will reach for those substances. And even before that, they'll show indications that there's something off, but they just don't have access to cigarettes, alcohol,
right,
cocaine, heroin, whatever. The vagus nerve is the way your body communicates to itself what the world looks like. And it's imperative to maintaining our good health to live in an environment that is essentially loving and happy.
Right. And also being aware of what we're exposing our senses to.
Oh, big time. If you watch a horror movie, you've thrown yourself into your sympathetic nervous system.
Right.
Guaranteed. That's
right,
what the horror is designed to do. And while that can be fun and exciting and exhilarating, it's also putting you in a mode where you're utilizing your body's resources as opposed to rejuvenating your body's resources.
Right.
In our modern, and there's nothing wrong with that. We need to use our body's resources all day long as we're balanced on the other end.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in our culture, we expose ourselves to too much stimulation, which means that we're communicating to our own vagus nerve, hey, let's go into the sympathetic nervous system. Let's be active.
Yeah.
Let's use our resources.
Right.
And not enough of we need to shut down the inputs, or we need to receive the kind of inputs that are nourishing to the parasympathetic nervous system.
Right. Exactly. And so, and I also wanted the fight, flight, and freeze response really interesting. I think, yes, we're in that mode a lot of the day in our modern world. And then you also spoke about the immobilization response, which I found fascinating.
So a lot of this work is from Stephen Porges. He wrote a book called The Polyvagal Theory.
Okay.
And he was one of the pioneers in really researching all this stuff. And one of the things his research was about was that, as mammals, we do this fight, flight, freeze thing. So if we're met with a life-threatening threat, we have a few choices, or basically our body chooses something. It's not always a conscious choice. And depending on how we assess the situation, we're either going to physically fight, we're going to run away, or we're going to freeze, remain in place.
Right.
But there's something else that can happen. And that's what he calls the immobilization response. And it's different. So go back to the reptilian days, when that's where we ultimately evolved from. And you take a lizard, and a lizard has a very different setup than we do. They have a very different metabolism than we do. And they don't need so much oxygen and blood to run all their higher brain functions. And so they have this great defense mechanism. They can basically stay completely still and hide and immobilize in a safe place away from predators for long periods of time without affecting their life as a whole. They just kind of shut down or go into like a temporary hibernation.
Okay.
And all their metabolic functions go to, almost flatline. And it allows them to remain completely motionless and completely in place for a long period of time. And basically a mammal predator or some other predator won't stick around. It'll go away. And that's a very good defense mechanism for that lizard. But we still have a piece of that lizard in us in our system. It's the part of the vagus nerve that's below the diaphragm.
Okay.
And now when we're walking around the world on a day-to-day basis, we do not engage the immobilization response. We will either fight, flight, or freeze, not as an immobilization, but just as a tactic to avoid a problem.
Okay.
So if we successfully deal with the problem, meaning if we fight and win, or if we run away successfully, or if the problem just disappears on its own, we're fine. Our bodies are built to handle that. But if we face this problem, and it's got to be a severe problem, it can't be some minor issue, right? It's got to be something that we perceive as pretty much life-threatening. If we face this problem and fighting doesn't work, running away doesn't work, we can't get away, and freezing doesn't work, meaning the problem doesn't just disappear on its own, our body goes back into that reptilian defense mechanism as an absolute last measure, which is the immobilization. And people like to say people play dead, but the reality is they're not playing dead, they're actually dying.
Wow.
So metabolic function, just like the lizard, starts to drop. Heart rate will drop. Higher brain function will disappear. People will basically go catatonic. And your body's literally, that's a physical response of the body to this threat. And it has certain advantages, like your pain tolerance goes way up. There's a last chance of intervention from an outside force to save you. Some things like that, really desperate last moment stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And what happens is your digestion completely shuts down, right? And let's say that you go into this mode, this immobilization mode, and something does save you. The threat does go away. And you can see this kind of thing in war, right? People face a life-threatening threat, they go catatonic, their body starts to shut down, but something does pull them out, something does save them. The problem is we are not well adapted to return from that state.
Okay.
So we don't come back right. Our vagus nerve doesn't switch back on properly. Or I should say it doesn't switch back into the parasympathetic nervous system easily. And what do we do with that? Typically, someone who experiences that gets ignored. Or we try to deal with it by giving them substances that don't really engage their parasympathetic nervous system. It just, kind of tries to pacify the situation.
Right.
They don't get the psychological help they need. They remain in the situation that was originally traumatizing. So the body's able to survive, but you're definitely not thriving.
Wow. So you're saying that someone could stay, if they've had this traumatic experience, they went into the immobilization response, that they could actually stay in that response even though they've got so-called treatment to pacify the symptoms?
Yeah, sure. Or take a class. There's a classic example. And I like using children because they have a special place in the sense that they're not a full-grown adult that can, fight tooth and nail to get out of a lot of situations, right?
Right.
So you take a kid and the kid's completely dependent on its caretakers or parents for survival. I mean, to ask a kid in the modern day to just, go out and fend for yourself, come on, that's not realistic, right?
Right.
So especially an infant. But the infant has a very active and vibrant vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve is constantly monitoring the world for threat and safety. And there are certain just universal cues of what's safe and what's threatening. So take an infant in an abusive household where the infant is completely dependent on the parents for survival. And it's a very unstable household. So let's say you get a case where the father is physically abusing the mother and the infant's observing this. That's going to trigger the infant because its whole source of survival is highly threatened.
Right.
And so now the infant can't fight. It can't fight. It can't possibly win that fight. And it can't run away. It can temporarily run away to a friend's house or at school or something like that. But every day it's returning back to that situation.
Right.
And the problem's not going to go away by the infant just freezing and waiting. And so the infant starts to immobilize to some extent. And now that creates like a dynamic in the life, right? So the infant gets dropped off at school, or the child gets dropped off at school, and maybe school is not so bad. There's not active physical abuse going on at school. So the infant starts to come back a little bit, but it doesn't just recover with the snap of a fingers. Right. So by the time it comes home, it's already damaged, or it's already out of balance.
Yeah.
It faces the same issue again and again and again and again and again. That person, that child's body, is going to be the function of that child's body, especially the digestion,
right,
is severely impaired.
Yeah.
As we know in Ayurveda, once the digestion goes, it's just a matter of time before everything else starts to go.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely. That's fascinating. That research on the immobilization response is fascinating.
Yeah, so that infant grows up, that child grows up to be a teenager, grows up to be an adult. And if they haven't done a lot of deep work and personal training to resolve that issue, it doesn't just go away. It doesn't just magically go away. That stays in their nervous system, and actually their nervous system has been trained to act that way. So they're actually going to be prone to go into that response when threatened. And moving into the future, they don't need to actually be in a situation that is actually life-threatening. It just has to remind them of a situation that's life-threatening. And that could be anything. That could be an empty refrigerator.
Right.
That could be the look on someone's face walking down the street. And their nervous system, bam, right into the sympathetic immobilization response they go.
Right.
And how's someone expected to live like that? They're going to try and cope. And if they don't know how to cope with it via wonderful, beautiful practices, they're going to cope with it with street drugs.
Of course, anything they can.
Right.
Yeah, and this reminds me of PTSD.
Absolutely. Right.
Wow.
It's this huge thing, and it is exactly and extremely associated with PTSD. I mean, basically damage to the vagus nerve is PTSD.
Yeah.
And it's imperative that someone who's suffering through that learn how to retrain their nervous system to the best of their ability to override that immobilization response and return to a place where they can voluntarily, consciously, and at will, basically, enter into their parasympathetic nervous system so that they can choose when their body is in a restorative mode versus when it's in a utilization mode.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, this is such amazing research. I'm so glad to speak to you today because I think this information is going to help a lot of people. And even if they're not themselves dealing with addictive behavior or trauma, but people around them having compassion for what happens. When people do go into this immobilization response, when you think that they're kind of numbing out, but in fact that is literally their body shutting down.
Absolutely. That is definitely going on.
Yeah.
And the good news is, because we've talked about a lot of bad news,
yes.
The good news is the vagus nerve is this incredible nerve that is a two-way street. So I mentioned that earlier, but it is a two-way street, meaning that it can change your mind. You can change your mind via your body, and you could change your body via your mind,
right?
Because of the vagus nerve, because it goes both ways. So what that means is now take something like yoga or Tai Chi or Qigong, or take your pick, right? Those are just the ones that are off the top of my head. And I personally am a yoga practitioner, so that's what I use mostly in my practice or clinic. So you take these asanas, postures, right? And you take these pranayamas, these breathing practices, and you chant these mantras which create vibrations through your vagus nerve. And you practice meditation and so on and so forth. They're all influencing in a physical, real way via your vagus nerve all the parts of your body and functions of your body. And so if you have trauma, or if you are in a state of constant stress or anxiety or whatever, things that we've been talking about today, you have a shot of retraining your system, and you don't necessarily need to go back into the trauma.
Right. That's what I love. Yes.
Yeah, you can retrain your vagus nerve, and it's called vagal tone, right? You tonify your vagus nerve to increase its capacity to deal with stress. So you basically develop your own resilience through these practices. The beautiful thing, especially about pranayama, breathing practices, is that the vagus nerve runs straight through the diaphragm and stomach from there. And so via your diaphragm, you can communicate with your vagus nerve. You can read whatever study you want. You can go through whatever teaching you want. It's been around thousands of years. There's no shortage of information or evidence or practiced people. I guarantee you there are some in your backyard that are practicing this regularly and changing how their vagus nerve and thus their entire body and system function by utilizing breathing practices.
Fantastic.
And that's why it works.
Yeah.
It's not crazy mystery.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Pranayama, essentially energy control, controlling the energy, controlling where you're directing that energy in the body and how you're responding to it.
Absolutely. And so you take one good, long, deep breath, you've just taken a big step to entering your parasympathetic nervous system.
Right. Right.
So now imagine doing that for half an hour.
Yeah.
You know, you can't substitute that with some kind of pill. I'm sorry, you just can't.
No.
And it's a huge deal. And in my personal belief, I think everyone in the world should practice pranayama.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes I think people disregard it because it is so simple.
It's right. And that's the beauty of it. It's so simple.
It's free. You can do it anywhere, anytime. Even if you're having a panic attack in the grocery store, you can do pranayama and nobody will even know you're doing it. But it's the quickest and fastest tool we have to bring our body into that parasympathetic nervous system. Absolutely.
And I do think there's something more to that, which is we have to understand about ourselves that when we go into a state of trauma or shock or distress or anxiety or stress, body wants to shorten and quicken the breath.
Yeah.
Because that's how it changes the system to deal with a threat effectively.
Right.
So there is an inborn innate desire when you're stressed to breathe in such a way that in the long run damages your health. In the short run can save your life.
Exactly.
But in the long run, if you're caught in that state, damages your health.
Right.
So you got to remember, and this is why it helps so much to practice in groups or with a teacher or with other people, is because you're going to forget, at least momentarily, when you get stressed, to breathe. Because that's part of the stress. Your body's entering a state where it wants to be breathing shallowly.
Yeah.
So that's why a consistent practice day after day is super important. And also being around other people who do that and can remind you if you do get stressed out, or simply, a lot of people are constantly stressed out. So when you walk into a class and you have an instructor, it's a lot easier to basically someone telling you to do it. You'll end up doing it when you're sitting in the context of a class.
Right.
Whereas if you're alone, you're not going to do it.
Right. Right. Absolutely.
Right. So if for all the beginners out there, I highly suggest starting out by doing it in groups or taking classes. Because that's what's going to get it in you at the beginning. And then once you've got it, you've got it.
Exactly. And then it's a reflex.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that's where you want to practice it to the point where it's instantly you feel that shallow breath coming on, that rapid breathing, that you know that you have that reflex now of shifting into that long, slower, calming breath.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That is the first sign that you're entering into the sympathetic nervous system, is that your breath is going to shorten.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a huge part of it. And that's what we deal with in Ayurveda. It's all about the education and the awareness, right? The awareness of and being in tune with your body so you recognize these subtle signals of when your body is shifting into a state where you don't want it to be.
Definitely. And as Ayurveda says relentlessly, if you can deal with something preemptively, it is way easier to deal with than once it's a full-blown disease.
Voila, exactly. Deal with it in the early stages. And that's where I'd love to shift to now, Victor, is what this wonderful science of Ayurveda says about treating addiction, because I really love that you said, you do not have to relive the trauma. And that's something I always believed in. I don't believe people have to re-experience and talk about the trauma that they went through and relive it, because I think that is as damaging as it was the first time they went through it. So if you could talk a little bit about that and how Ayurveda treats addiction.
Sure.
Please.
Ayurveda, if you look at Ayurveda from the lens of this whole vagus nerve thing, you will clearly see that most Ayurvedic protocols are encouraging someone to enter into their parasympathetic nervous system for most of the day. So one thing I definitely don't want to do is villainize the sympathetic nervous system and sanctify the parasympathetic nervous system, because you need both.
Yeah.
You can't walk around the world not, just always residing in your parasympathetic nervous system. There are times where you need to utilize your sympathetic nervous system. It's the ratio that's important.
Right.
So Ayurveda prescribes, depending on your constitution and depending on the individual, of course, but basically for the majority of the day, you should be residing in your parasympathetic nervous system. And then when you need to, act in such a way that puts you into your sympathetic nervous system, you do so. And then you easily switch back. So Ayurveda, if you take Panchakarma, for example, which is an Ayurvedic therapy protocol. Or it's basically it's an Ayurvedic therapy protocol that is for deep detoxification and rejuvenation of the tissues over a period of time. In a nutshell, of course, it's a massive science in and of itself. So that's not doing it justice. But given our limits and time limits, and
voila, yeah.
So in a nutshell, you enter into this room, and you enter into a room with practitioners who know your constitution. They know your individual health history. They spent a long time talking with you and finding out who you are from the perspective of both your body and your mind. And they've gotten to know you pretty well. So they're administering therapies and protocols that are customized completely to you. And you go and you receive a number of therapies, and they all encourage the parasympathetic response. So you lay on a table and you have two people giving you warm herbal oil massages simultaneously in sync. That's very conducive to entering the parasympathetic nervous system.
Absolutely.
It has to be done in a safe environment. So you're in a safe environment. It's usually very private besides the practitioners. So, for example, you're not in a hospital surrounded by other dying people. Right. Which can be very terrifying.
Absolutely.
Right. So you're in a very safe environment entering into a parasympathetic, which is crucial to entering the parasympathetic nervous system. All the scents and sounds and colors are beautiful and nourishing and relaxing. So all your senses, all five senses, are being stimulated and informed that, hey, you should probably go into your parasympathetic nervous system. You're safe here. And all this is going on. You're taking the right herbs and plant medicines. You're eating food that's very easy to digest, so that your system can devote all of its resources to healing. Right. And you're being counseled. You're being talked to. You're being helped work through some of the harder aspects of life. All these things are big signals that, hey, like, you can turn around, you can heal, you can be safe, you can be happy, you can be healthy, you can be holy. All these things are being constantly reinforced day after day after day after day, physically and mentally and spiritually. And that clicks in with the vagus nerve, and the vagus nerve releases. And then once that happens, it's now communicating to the body, okay, go ahead and heal now.
Right. You're safe.
Go ahead and focus your resources on digesting, on rebuilding tissue, on functioning harmoniously with every other organ in the body. Right. And you're good. That can't happen after 10 minutes. Right. Right. And so at the same time you're doing this panchakarma stuff, you're practicing pranayama, which we just talked about. You're in the therapy room for 3 to 4 hours a day, and then the rest of the day, ideally you're spending in a really great, wonderful, beautiful place, and so on and so forth.
Yes.
So that's like a heavy dose of this stuff, right? But not everyone can just run away and do panchakarma forever.
Right.
But that's not what it's meant to be. It's meant to be a springboard to help your body remember. And then you maintain certain lifestyle practices, like Ayurveda says, eat at the right times, because that's going to affect your vagus nerve, right? You need to go to sleep at the right times, because that's going to affect your vagus nerve. You should you should eat the right foods, all, so on and so forth. All these things are communications of basically self-love.
Yeah.
And when you can get to that place, you feel safe and you remember yourself as spirit, and you remove that core anxiety, and then you'll be okay.
It's beautiful, and it's so rejuvenating as well, and there's no reliving that past trauma that we spoke about earlier. And also with this panchakarma, there's lots of herbalized oils used. Everything's tailored to the individual, and it's also getting deep into the tissues and into the cells where some of that trauma can still reside, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. So your nervous system remembers.
Yeah.
So, we can experience this ourselves. If we have a powerful memory from our youth, whether it's positive or negative, you can practically feel it in your body if you recall it.
Yeah.
So the feeling of a hug, the feeling of whatever, everyone has their own personal things. It's stored in your body. So when these places are nourished with substances that are healing, your body knows that in a real way. And it can help unravel trauma without re-exposing yourself to the trauma, which will re-engage the fight, flight, freeze, immobilize circuit.
Right, exactly.
Now, one comment on that is that once you have retrained your vagus nerve, and once you have developed its resilience, if it were imbalanced or damaged, you may very well be able to re-enter the situation that used to be traumatizing to you, and be completely okay.
Oh, great.
I'm not saying you're not going to feel anything or that you've forgotten what happened, but you may not have the same visceral response that you once did, because you've healed that channel.
Right.
And that's a very positive sign that you've done some really deep work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That belief system has been nipped in the bud at the root.
Yeah, in a manifested bodily way.
Yeah. Yes,
and
exactly.
That's really what Ayurveda is trying to get us to. Ayurveda says, okay, these spiritual things are wonderful and they're very real in the body. And so Ayurveda says, well, my role in this human life is to help people manifest health and these spiritual, wonderful things inside their body in a real way.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we want to be embodied in Ayurveda.
Right, exactly. And exactly, that goes to your point a moment ago that I wanted to reiterate again, is that we need to embody the practices of Ayurveda and the daily dinacharya or self-care practices, so that you're not just going for panchakarma or some treatments and then going back to the way things used to be, that it has to be a shift, that there has to be this daily self-love, this daily taking care of and nurturing your body, right?
Oh, big time. And that is a huge thing we face, because this is it's not a place where you walk into and say, okay, I got oil rubbed on me and now I go home and I do all my bad habits.
Right.
The challenge is we do our bad habits because of what we've already talked about in this talk. And the challenge with people a lot of times who come in is that, for panchakarma specifically, is that they have an experience, but then they return to the environment that's very threatening to them.
Yeah.
So part of the whole healing and part of Ayurveda in a huge way is how we build our lifestyle.
Exactly.
We have to be willing to change our relationships, our environments, our careers sometimes. I'm not necessarily saying you have to leave your career. I'm saying you have to change the dynamics inside the career that are way more conducive to a healthy life, as opposed to just, taking a substance, letting it do what it does, feeling a little bit better, and then returning to all the damaging things that we do.
Right. You have to be an active participant.
On a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
This takes time, but it doesn't take time to start. It just takes time to complete.
Exactly. And it is an amazing journey because it really is that journey to your true self, to your true nature. So it's a fascinating journey as you begin to make these shifts and changes. And
massively joyful and beneficial. Of course, there are tough roads. With addiction, there's always the moment. They feel better. And they're what we see all the time is someone comes in and they're either doing consultations in a protocol or they're doing panchakarma. Mm-hmm. And they're actually fairly easily able to stop some of the heavier addictive substances. Mm. Not everybody, a lot of people. And because they have this desire in them to get better. And so that goes along for a while, but inevitably they come across a trigger or something threatening.
Right.
And there's going to be that moment where that thing inside the body, inside the vagus nerve, or the communication that the vagus nerve gives, is extraordinarily drawn towards the thing that used to keep them safe.
Of course, yeah.
At that moment, and hopefully they have some support around them, but not always. Mm. At that moment is the big crucial factor where someone has the ability to create a new pattern inside their body.
Right.
And it happens every time. It's 100%. There's no way that anyone's going to gloss over that on the healing journey. Mm. So we come to our own traumas by going on the healing journey. We don't have to seek them out over and over again.
Right.
They'll show up on the path, and then we can move beyond them.
Beautiful. And Victor, do you have a case study actually that you could share with us today? I think that'd be fascinating for people to hear. If there's something you could share.
Yes, I have a case study. I think we get enough bad news in the world, and there are plenty of those case studies, so I'll give a positive case study.
Wonderful. That sounds great.
So, let's take a 22-year-old male. I'll call him Jason. I use this guy in the presentation at NAMA. And there's a real story. So Jason, he's addicted to everything under the sun. He's addicted to cigarettes. He's addicted to alcohol. He smokes whatever plant he could get his hand on. Hallucinogens, mushrooms, LSD, acid, done all those things. All of it. Extremely addictive behavior, without a doubt, right? Has severe social anxiety, which is underneath all those addictions. Completely abandoned by his parents. He wasn't a foster child, but his parents were not present in his life at all. They just didn't show up for him. So he got very little love. The friendships he were able to develop were around drugs. So you can't call it a friendship. It's more of a codependent relationship, right?
Yes.
Where help each other get drugs, and then, that's how. But that feels like some kind of connection, so it's better than nothing.
Right.
So obviously, Vata agitated, Vata deranged. Mm-hmm. Severely underweight, extremely malnourished, the digestion's almost completely shut down, all the signs of a damaged vagus nerve, right? So he shows up to a yoga class for the first time and is inspired by the teacher, senses for whatever reason, and, without getting into details, but for whatever reason feels that this is a safe place. And is inspired by the one leading the class. So the teacher, it makes him feel very safe. So decides on the spot that this feels better than the other thing. And within a day has ceased all substance use.
Wow.
Right. So that alone tells you that there's something there. Mm-hmm. Starts engaging the people who are practicing yoga and the yoga teacher more and more on a day-to-day basis, and continues to develop in that direction. He stayed engaged with them on a day-to-day basis. That's the important part, and got a lot of support, especially at the beginning.
Great.
And never had to use a substance to fill that void in him during that period of time. Now, of course, he can't permanently depend on those people to fulfill all his social needs, right? Mm-hmm. But it was what he needed to get started and kick the habits.
That's fantastic.
it reminded him that there was love and caring in the world.
Right, exactly. That
Now
connection.
that connection's made, and now the world's a much safer place for him.
Wow.
And then now he starts to create his own safety in his own lifestyle. So he stops doing the crazy things that were very dangerous and destroying his health, and he starts doing the things that incorporate good health. And so he starts building his own safety upward spiral, so to speak.
Fantastic.
And so his desire for substances, and he'll freely admit that, yeah, once in a while he still gets a craving for something, right? And usually when he's feeling low or crappy, or when he's feeling exhilarated or extremely happy, it goes away. It's either extreme.
Okay.
But what that tells us is anytime he's deeply engaged in his sympathetic nervous system,
Right.
he can sometimes feel an urge to use drugs, but he doesn't.
Okay.
Since that day, he's never used a substance again.
That is amazing.
Now,
Wow.
he hasn't dealt with every single issue in his life. He still has some neuroses, and he still has social anxiety to a certain extent. But we're talking about night and day.
Right. Right.
No, we're not talking perfection here. We're just talking about, you look at that guy and you're like, okay, that's real. That guy was going to die by the age of 30, right? And even if he didn't, he was going to live a miserable life.
Yes.
And now, much better.
Wow.
So, go ahead.
No. I was just going to riff on that a little bit, that, you were talking about this love and connection that he felt. And that was a big thing, that he had felt he was in a safe environment, felt supported by that yoga community. And then I was going to segue into that Portugal study you mentioned, because I think that was fascinating as well.
Yeah, the Portugal study is a wonderful study. That's basically that case study on a huge scale.
Right.
So Portugal study, you can find information on it easily. You just look it up. And it's this great study where Portugal had this terrible drug addiction issue. Their entire population. It was huge. And so, the typical thing is someone gets caught doing illicit drugs and they go to jail.
Right.
And that basically further traumatizes them. And so what happens is they just want to use drugs more. So Portugal hired this group of people to basically say, come up with the real solution to this problem. And so this group of people came up with this fantastic solution. They basically said, okay, here's what you're going to do. Instead of basically throwing a bunch of people in jail and punishing them, you're going to take drug users and you're going to start connecting them with just anyone and everyone, under the condition that they're doing some kind of wholesome activity. So a lot of times it was community gardens or something like that. But the whole point is that just provides a safe container for social interaction.
Right.
And erases the isolation loneliness problem. Because isolation, I haven't mentioned this yet, but isolation is a threat to the vagus nerve.
Right.
If a human finds himself isolated, I'm not talking about spending some time alone. I'm talking about genuinely feeling isolated. That's a life threat to a human being.
Yeah.
So basically end that whole problem and start connecting people. Give them social interaction in a wholesome way. And I mean, the results were incredible. The addiction rates were cut in half.
Amazing.
And you're talking about a whole nation.
Wow.
So it's just this further evidence and just more light being shown on the fact that it's like, guys, the reason people are abusing these substances is because they can't get any love and connection, and they're suffering because of it. And so they're just reaching for the next thing that they can find to try and take away suffering. We don't have to complexify it and make it into this whole huge thing. It's just that.
Yeah, and when you go back to that stat that you mentioned at the start, with the average teen taking, 1.2 central nervous system drugs, that, when we look at the disconnection we're having today with social media and mobile devices, and, there's definitely the connection. And I mean, we can't go into that now too much in this podcast, and we've talked about it before on the podcast, but definitely is a connection there between the rise of these mobile devices and feeling isolated and then this dependency on these drugs and these central nervous system drugs.
Yeah, and it's the tough thing is that these devices have gotten to the point where they're intentionally being created to addict.
Right, exactly.
So try and, if we just always to bring it home to Ayurveda terms, it's going to create a huge Vata imbalance inside somebody.
Yeah.
Once that happens, anything can go wrong.
Yeah.
And so as a culture, we need to be much more responsible about helping our youth, especially because they carry a certain level of innocence that is like, I'm not going to hand you something that's intentionally designed to addict you for my own personal conveniences because I don't want to deal with something that I don't want to deal with. But that's what's happening.
Yeah.
You can't give a 3-year-old an iPad and expect that 3-year-old not to get addicted to it.
Right. Absolutely.
So we got to realize that and check ourselves because maybe we're suffering from loneliness, isolation, lack of love, all those things. And we're just unwittingly, or we don't know what to do, but we're transferring it to our youth.
Yeah, absolutely. That's just definitely something we have to be aware of, and particularly if you have children, having that awareness that these devices really do affect and derange Vata, and Vata is the one dosha that can have huge, massive effects on Kapha and Pitta as well, because it moves the other doshas around the body. So we really have to have awareness on that. And on that note, Victor, can you give some advice to someone today who's out there, who's dealing with addictive behavior, or if somebody they know is dealing with addictive behavior, what's one step that they could take?
One step that they could take would be to start immediately practicing pranayama.
I love it. Yeah, absolutely.
That would be step number one. Step number one, take a deep breath.
Right.
Step number two is seek out assistance.
Yeah.
So, but that's not just anybody, right? Because the challenge is, part of the challenge is, if you have someone traumatized, they don't trust easily. And because they've been traumatized, how could they, right?
Yeah.
But that's going to be the next step, is that if you can start practicing breathing, at least trust that, and trust anyone who's trying to help you do that. If you're struggling with addiction or know someone who is, and you can start there, then that's going to reopen the doors to trusting at least someone who's tuned in to a very real way to help you.
Right.
And maybe from there, the journey will evolve into seeing some kind of holistic practitioner who really knows how to work with these things and get someone into their parasympathetic nervous system. And the more you can induce that state, the better the process is going to, or the more advanced, the more steps you will take on the healing path.
Right. And
you'll get to a point where the addictions will drop.
Yeah. Beautiful. So
that's the first step.
And
it's got to be
the breath. And that's a very simple step to take. And guys out there, I have a free pranayama tutorial. I'll put a link in the show notes so you can have access to that, and it shows you how to do it. So even just use that free link and just experiment in your own body and feel the differences for yourself, because it is amazing, it is effective, and it can definitely help a lot. So, Victor, thank you so much for all that amazing information. And can you tell us where listeners can go to find out more about you and your offerings, please?
Sure, absolutely. My organization is called Pacific Coast Ayurveda, which I run with my fellow Ayurvedic doctor, Dr. Madison Madden, who also was on your program.
Yes.
And you can always call us. We prefer calls at 707-225-8844. You can also visit our website and look up all sorts of information about us and what we do at pcayurveda.com. And the clinic is part of a larger collection of businesses that fly under the banner of Center for Applied Consciousness. And that center and the Ayurveda clinic were founded by a man named Joseph Rich, who is and has been a Kundalini yoga teacher for over 20 years. And so that's part of our offering here, is we offer a lot of yoga. And my wife, Jennifer, runs a wellness and yoga / Ayurveda retreat company called Root Down Retreats. So that's another branch of our tree.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and you can get information on the whole collective by visiting center4ac.com, and that's center, the number 4, A as in apple, C as in cat.com.
Great. That's fantastic. Yes, and we spoke about that collective the last time on the podcast episode with Madison, and that sounds like an amazing supportive group of practitioners.
Yes, support is key, and we like to, people who come up and visit us, even when they're doing Ayurveda, we like them to be exposed to a bunch of different energies and people, and to us, that's all part of the getting well process.
Yeah, that's fantastic. A wonderful community there. So you can head on over to the show notes. I'll have all the links there that Victor just mentioned. So just click on over to the show notes and we'll get you over to those websites. Victor, thank you so much for sharing all your research and insights today. I think this is such valuable information for people to learn about, and I really appreciate you taking the time. So thank you.
Thank you, Colette. Appreciate it.
Well, Victor, take good care of yourself and be well.
Absolutely. You too.
Thank you. All the best.
You too.
Such wonderful information there from Victor. And again, really appreciate him sharing all his research and insights into addiction and the vagus nerve. So I hope you found that helpful. And of course, if you think that a family member or friend could benefit from this information, please share this episode with them. We want to get this empowering information out there to people. And also, don't forget that all the links that Victor mentioned will be in the show notes. And I'll also put the link to my website, elementshealingandwellbeing.com, where you can find out about my services and consultations and cleanses and my upcoming retreat right here on the French Riviera that's happening October 11th to the 13th. It's an Ayurveda and Yoga retreat, and it's going to be a weekend full of connection and healing and education and empowerment. So check that out over there on my website also. Thank you so much for tuning in. Take good care of yourself. Be well, and ciao for now.